Hey, good afternoon, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Coral Gartner and I'm the Director of the Centre of Research Excellence on Achieving the Tobacco Endgame. And I'd like to welcome you to this webinar that's hosted by the Centre of Research Excellence. Before we begin, I'd like to first acknowledge that I am on the unceded lands of the Jagera and Turrbal peoples, and that is in Meanjin. I would like to pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I also extend that respect and acknowledgement to all First Nations people who are joining us for this online event, and I recognise the lands that we are all joining from and their traditional owners. Today's speaker is Dr. Yvette van der Eijk, who is an assistant professor at the Saw Sui Hock School of Public Health at National University of Singapore. And she leads research to support tobacco policies in Singapore, but also works on global tobacco control, commercial determinants of health more broadly, and also maternal health. Now, so if you have some questions during the webinar, I'd ask you to use the Q&A function. So just pop your questions in there, and we should have time at the end of the presentation to have some Q&A and some moderated discussion. So do please use the Q&A function. So now I'd like to hand over the microphone to Yvette to deliver her presentation, which is on towards a more inclusive global tobacco endgame. Thanks, Yvette.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Carl. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining. And okay, so for this talk, I would like to focus a bit on, I would like us to zoom out and look at the global tobacco endgame as a global movement, right? Because I think now, especially nowadays, we're at a point in time where the tobacco endgame has taken root in different countries of the world now, right? So there are multiple countries now that have set tobacco endgame targets, which is the goal to be completely tobacco-free by a certain cut-off date or by a certain year. And we're seeing that this is happening not just in countries in just one region, but it's in multiple regions now as well. And we're also seeing more of a global momentum, for instance, with a new committee to help the implementation of Article 2.1 in different countries to help them with their novel tobacco endgame measures. So I think now is a very good time to really take a step back and zoom out and look at, okay, globally, what is going on with the tobacco endgame? So what are the countries around the world that have set different tobacco endgame targets? How are they planning to achieve this and by when? And then also to try and systematically identify those countries that may be ready for a tobacco endgame. Okay, so first of all, what would it take for a country to succeed in a tobacco endgame? What are the ways or the attributes that we can use to systematically identify those countries? And what are the different challenges that may present in some of those different world regions, right? So essentially, how can we turn the endgame into a global movement, much like how we've turned tobacco control into a global movement through frameworks like the FCTC? Okay, so let's see. All right, so before I get going, I would just like to acknowledge my two students, Sahana and Sureshwin, who've been working on this project and who've done a really great job with it. So most of the data that I'll be presenting from this comes from a study which we published last year in Lancet Global Health. There's a QR code there if you want to read more about it. But essentially what we did here is we wanted to identify, first of all, using systematic scoping review methods. Okay, what are the countries around the world that have adopted a national tobacco endgame target? And what are the details of their action plans? And also those countries that are covered by regional targets. Okay, so what are those regional targets and where are they covered? So essentially, what is the status, the global status of the tobacco endgame movement currently? And then secondly, we also wanted to systematically identify countries that may be ready for a tobacco endgame based on low smoking prevalence and advanced FCTC measures. Okay, so I mean, first of all, just to provide a bit of context. So when we look at the tobacco endgame globally as a whole, okay, when we look at what different countries have been doing, different targets that they've set, generally speaking, the tobacco endgame aims to reduce smoking rates to a near zero level by a certain year. So most countries have chosen a time frame of around 15 years from when the target was set. So most of those targets fall between 2030 and 2040 currently. When we talk about near zero levels, this is defined differently, but generally speaking, in most countries, there seems to be a smoking prevalence rate of around 5% or less. Some countries have gone for slightly more ambitious targets like 1%, and some countries have also adopted differential targets based on different subpopulations of interest, right? So for example, populations with higher smoking rates and attempts to try and reduce those disparities across different subpopulations. And then there are different approaches that have been adopted across different countries. Again, this varies, but there are certain approaches that are more popular than others. Tobacco-free generation proposal has proven to be a fairly popular approach across different countries as part of their action plan. So the tobacco-free generation, essentially, this would deny tobacco sales to people born after a certain cutoff date. So this would leave the current smokers alone while phasing out tobacco use among those younger folks, right? So it works progressively over time. So there are different countries in the world, notably in Europe, that have adopted this as part of their tobacco endgame plan. New Zealand was slated to adopt this last year. And then we see across the US, also across quite a few of the different localities, there's been quite a strong movement for tobacco-free generation, with some of these measures being adopted in different localities. Other novel measures that have proven popular or that were set to be adopted, most of these I would say come from New Zealand's example. So New Zealand, on top of the tobacco-free generation, was also slated to denicotinize cigarettes, essentially taking the nicotine content out of cigarettes to a level at which they're no longer addicting. So this was part of their action plan for their endgame. And another part of it would have been drastically reducing the retailers that could sell tobacco products, right? And then more of the same kind of measures. This is an approach that we see very much across different countries' action plans for tobacco endgame. So by that, I essentially mean ramping up of FCTC measures or measures consistent with that. So things like more smoke-free areas, higher tobacco taxes, plain packaging, more intensive quit support, and so forth. So it's essentially the measures that we're doing, just implemented to a higher standard, filling in those gaps in the policy, essentially. So these are the kind of approaches that we see most commonly across those countries that have actually adopted official endgame targets. And when we look at the endgame countries around the world, okay, so this map shows those countries that have an official tobacco endgame target to be tobacco-free by a certain year, or that have implemented or adopted tobacco-free generation measures, okay? So currently there are 18 countries with such targets. US is actually not one of them, but I've shaded it here because across the local level, there have been areas where they have already adopted tobacco-free generation or actually banned tobacco sales altogether. So because of the leadership there, I wanted to also include the US. And then on top of that, you see there are two circles. These are two regions of the world that actually are covered by a regional tobacco endgame target. So this is the South Pacific Islands and the European Union. Okay, so 2 world regions in 18 countries are officially striving to be tobacco-free by a certain year, typically between 2030 and 2040. Okay, so I mean, we wanted to systematically understand, okay, so what makes a country endgame ready? Because actually no study to my knowledge really has systematically looked at that, okay? Although there has been quite a lot of discussion about this in the literature already. So typically when we look at these discussions, there are 4 major attributes that are considered to make a country endgame ready, okay? So the first one is a strong anti-tobacco climate, all right? So climate among, like a social climate among the public, but also among the policymakers, right? Second is a strong political will, right? And this one does seem to be pretty consistent and pretty important across the different countries as well. And we see how this can change for the better or for worse, right? So for example, when we look at New Zealand's example, I mean, New Zealand in 2024 would have been the first country to really implement a rigorous action plan, which would have included novel measures to achieve their endgame target for 2025, right? But then we see that the situation changed very quickly within just the space of, well, a few weeks, because then the new political party that was voted in months before this was set to take place then scrapped that whole plan and it was completely turned around. But we also see the political situation change, you know, a country's endgame adoption for the better, right? So we see countries like, for example, Denmark and Netherlands, which, you know, didn't really have much leadership in tobacco control for a long time, had high smoking rates, weak FCTC measures. And we see that the situation in those countries has turned around very quickly too, just with the right leadership and the right motivation. We see smoking rates going down quickly and FCTC measures being adopted very quickly in these kind of countries. So political will can change quickly, can be volatile, but it can also be a very, very important component of this. So this is what we see across those different countries. When we talk about smoking prevalence, right, typically what is considered to be, you know, a smoking prevalence at which a country is considered endgame ready is 15% or less. Although admittedly, this is a bit of an arbitrary number. And as we'll see later, I do believe that there's more nuance needed in this kind of interpretation. And fourthly, advanced tobacco control measures aligned with the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, or FCTC, right? So countries that have already rigorously adopted all of the different measures and are now basically looking for more novel measures to essentially get rid of tobacco. But again, I do think a little more nuance is needed with this one as well, as we'll see later. Okay, so, or just before I start on that, so essentially what we did when we wanted to systematically identify those countries that may be endgame ready, right? What we did is we clustered them based on the last 2 attributes. And the reason is because it's pretty difficult to quantify tobacco climate our anti-tobacco climate and political will, right? Because that can change fairly quickly. So we clustered the countries based on the smoking prevalence and the tobacco control implementation based on FCTC. So what we did there is we used FCTC scores that are provided through the World Health Organization's monitoring system. And then we used the CIATGA's FCTC scorecard to then weight how rigorously each of these measures had been implemented, and then give countries an overall score out of 100, a percentage score, essentially. So we tried to identify visual clusters, but we didn't find any. So we used 2 cutoff points to cluster the countries. Okay, so the first one was the FCTC score. So the median score was 68%. So countries that were higher than that, above FCTC score above 68%, we consider those to have a more advanced implementation of FCTC measures, and then those that below it were considered to have less advanced. And then for smoking prevalence, our cutoff point was 50%, which is considered, in literature to be the smoking prevalence cutoff for an endgame readiness, and then 15% or higher. So then we ended up with 4 clusters. So the cluster that we're more interested in, of course, is the endgame ready cluster in dark green. So these are the countries with above average FCTC implementation and lower smoking rates, right? And then the other ones, we clustered them as follows. So the ones that had a higher prevalence, but still fairly advanced FCTC measures, we consider them to be almost endgame ready, right? So perhaps more time, more effort is needed to bring it down to that 15%. Then countries with a lower prevalence but lower FCTC scores, they were considered in the early epidemic stage, right? And then those countries with weak FCTC scores but higher smoking prevalence were considered to have more action necessary, in tobacco control as a whole. So this is what our world looks like currently, based on the data that we used, which was from 2021, right? So I would like to first draw our attention to these regions, okay, the ones that I've circled here in blue, because these are the regions where the countries that have set tobacco endgame targets, that's where these countries are currently situated. So if you recall the map I showed you earlier with all the countries shaded in blue, these are our endgame countries. They were in North America, in Western Europe. We have Bhutan and Bangladesh circled in South Asia. Then there's Malaysia, and then Australia and New Zealand. So these are the countries with official tobacco endgame targets. And one interesting thing that we observed is that there's really no pattern to it, right? I mean, we would expect that most of these countries would fall into the endgame ready cluster, which is shaded in dark green, right? So those countries with advanced FCTC measures, low smoking prevalence. But actually what we see is that there's really no pattern to it, hardly at all. I mean, the only countries that really fit that mold, if you like, is the UK, Bhutan, and New Zealand, right? But most of them are actually countries with higher smoking rates. So most of them have a smoking prevalence above 15%. For most countries, we noticed it was around 20%, okay? So moderate smoking rates. And then a number of other countries on top of that also had fairly weak FCTC measures. But these are also countries where we've seen a quick turnaround in recent years, okay? Where we see the situation has changed and they're kind of on a very good trajectory, even if they're not quite there yet, okay? So when we talk about the factors that actually seem to drive a tobacco endgame, right? Strong anti-tobacco climate, definitely, which then of course ties in with strong political will and strong advocacy for a tobacco endgame. This is something that we see quite consistently, even in countries where, for example, they were falling into the more action-needed cluster, countries like Malaysia, for instance. We see that there's been more political will, more advocacy for tobacco endgame, which then of course drives that. When it comes to smoking prevalence, we realize that actually probably the cutoff point of 15% may be too narrow. Perhaps countries that may be endgame ready, it's not necessarily that they need a very low prevalence, perhaps low to moderate prevalence, or a prevalence that has been rapidly reducing over a short period of time, because that also indicates that there's a strong will to drive down rates and that there's a momentum for an endgame. And then finally, countries need not have so advanced tobacco control measures. It's more down to the kind of trajectory that they're currently on. So it seems to be more down to, where there has been steady progress, where there has been a lot of momentum, strong political will to get things going quickly, coupled with, say, a rapidly reducing or already somewhat low to moderate smoking prevalence. Those things seem to be laying the ground. And this is the kind of traits that we see more in common with what we would call the endgame countries, those with endgame targets. And another thing that we noticed is that some of these countries, they weren't afraid to be the first in some ways, right? These 5 countries are all endgame countries with official targets, right? So Australia was the first to have a plain packaging mandate, right? Canada was the first to go ahead and implement a tobacco flavors ban and cigarette warnings on individual sticks. Finland was the first country to set a national tobacco endgame target. way back in, I think it was even before the 2010s. And then Netherlands was the first to have a supermarket sales ban for tobacco products. And Ireland was the first country to have smoke-free bars in restaurants. So in that sense, all of these countries led the way with certain measures, which may also, that willingness to kind of be the first in this uncharted territory also, of course, is one attribute that seems to make countries endgame ready in that sense, right? But then, of course, as we see with the plain packaging mandate, where one country goes in, many others will follow. And this is, of course, what we're seeing now also with this endgame momentum around the world. Okay, at this point, I'd like to turn our attention to countries with more advanced FCTC measures based on our clustering exercise, okay? So these are all shaded in green. So the ones that are shaded in dark green are those countries that we considered endgame ready, okay? So these are the ones with a low smoking prevalence, less than 15%, and advanced FCTC measures. And those in light green also have advanced FCTC measures, but they have a somewhat higher smoking prevalence. Oftentimes, this is more of a moderate prevalence ranging from the 20s to the 30s, right? So one interesting thing that I would like to highlight here is that they are really in regions that really have not received a lot of attention in the global tobacco endgame at all, right? I mean, when we talk about the global tobacco endgame and the discussions and the countries that have set official targets, most of them are in the Western world, right? North America, Western Europe, Australasia. Very few of them are really outside those regions. Whereas when you look at the endgame ready cluster, the dark green one, most of those countries are in low and middle income regions, right? Like Latin America, like Africa, like this belt from the Middle East to South Asia, where endgame, the whole tobacco endgame concept hasn't necessarily been officially considered, okay? So there's so much potential really to explore a tobacco endgame concept in these regions. And it's unclear really why Endgame hasn't really received or doesn't seem to have received much attention in these regions. Part of it could be the fact that these are low middle income regions, so there may be resources, maybe limitations there. It could maybe be because the concept, maybe it doesn't translate so directly and more thought needs to be put into that. It's unclear really what the challenges are. But anyway, I'd like to turn our attention to each region one by one, right? So let's start with Latin America. So Latin America is one region where really there's a lot of potential, because when you look at some of the progress that has been made in tobacco control, it's really quite good, right? So Latin America has among the highest rates of FCTC implementation globally. And Latin America is also a region that has seen smoking prevalence drop very quickly within a very short time. So within 15 years, smoking prevalence in this region dropped by over 50%. Right? So it's definitely a place where if we think about trajectories and what makes a region endgame ready, when I talked about earlier, I say, okay, it's more about how quickly prevalence is dropping. It's more about the momentum they're having. This region could have a lot of potential too. And especially countries like Brazil, because Brazil was actually the first country in the world to implement all M-Power measures. And they also led the way with flavored cigarettes ban, right? So, I mean, they were sued by the tobacco industry over that measure, so they weren't able to go ahead with it. But it was the first country to really seriously consider such a measure. So I think there's a lot of scope to explore more in this region, and I think really a lot more thought needs to be put into, okay, how can this endgame concept translate to this region? What are some of the barriers lacking? How can more resources or more support be made available to try and create more momentum for that in this region? Africa is another region that I'd like to turn our attention to, because there are quite a number of countries that could be endgame ready here as well. So actually, Africa has been leading the way recently on tobacco control as well, right? Now, one challenge in this region is there's a lot of tobacco industry investment here, partly because of the younger demographic. So Africa has, their younger demographic is growing very quickly. So for the tobacco industry, for their perspective, it's a good investment for them to try and target the youth so that they can have a booming population of smokers there in a couple of decades, right? So they've been having a lot of aggressive targeting from the industry, right? Both in the way of youth marketing, but also in the way of trying to lobby against different measures. So, this kind of industry interference is something that needs to be paid a lot more attention to. And I think that would be a very important part of an endgame strategy there, potentially, is reducing industry interference and industry marketing to young people. Also, another specific challenge that we see in some of these countries, which we may not have encountered in some of the endgame countries we have currently, as in countries with official endgame targets, is the presence of tobacco farming, right? Because for certain countries to be able to set an endgame target, also we would need to pay more attention on, okay, how can those farmers be weaned off tobacco crops? That whole economic argument is perhaps more important in these countries. So perhaps those endgame targets would have to have differential targets. For example, okay, what are the targets for reducing the reliance on tobacco farming within each different time frame, for instance. And then also, of course, the challenges of implementation and enforcement, because these require resources. And that goes for all of the countries, especially those where resources may be lacking for tobacco control and enforcement. South Asia is another region that I think there's a lot of scope here, and there's a lot more room to discuss and to understand what would it take to achieve a tobacco endgame here. Particular challenges to this region. Okay, so first of all, I mean, when we calculated our smoking prevalence cutoffs, this was mostly cigarette use prevalence. Okay, so this prevalence does not include, use of alternative tobacco products like smokeless tobacco or shisha. So chances are these kind of products are used more widely in this region. So that may also help to partly explain those lower smoking prevalence rates. But it also means that for countries like this, where there are high rates of these alternative tobacco products use, when developing those endgame targets, attention needs to be paid to these other products too. So, okay, what kind of tobacco endgame targets would we have for these products? How long would it take us to achieve certain prevalence rates for other product use? Okay, and I know the same principle really goes to the vaping products. That also depends on the situation within each country, right? And then also one interesting thing that we noted about this region is that some of these countries have fairly unique political climates, which may actually facilitate something like a total sales ban. So just banning tobacco sales altogether might actually be feasible in some of these countries, right? And one of them, which is Bhutan, has actually done this, right? So in 2004, I believe it was. Anyway, in the 2000s, Bhutan actually banned all tobacco imports and sales. Now, this ban was reversed during the pandemic because of concerns about illicit trade, and they haven't re-implemented the ban since. But it does show that, where the right will is there, where the right political climate is there, something like that may actually be feasible. Another interesting example of this sort is Turkmenistan. So Turkmenistan has a very autocratic government, and they're actually aiming to be tobacco-free by a certain year as well. I read up on this more recently after we finished this study. So, so different political climates may facilitate different approaches. This whole, like implementing the FCTC measures more rigorously or step-by-step approaches may not actually be necessary. It depends on the climate. And again, I'd like to highlight the example of India here, mainly because of the progress that has been made in this country that I think has been overlooked quite a lot. So India is an interesting example because India also has had very rapidly reducing smoking prevalence rates, right? So smoking prevalence has dropped there by over 50%. And also India has some novel measures too, right? So in movies with smoking scenes in India, they have to show a health warning during the actual scene. So I've actually seen these Bollywood movies where where the characters light up, and then somewhere on the screen will be a message like "smoking kills you." And so I thought that was actually a very interesting approach to raising awareness. And in that sense, India has some novel approaches too. So yeah, there's certainly potential in all of these regions, but I guess the bottom line is that we need to understand how the tobacco endgame concept, as we've already developed it for many of these Western high-income countries, how that would apply to all of these different regions, okay? Because they each have their own unique context, their unique culture, and unique struggles with different things that I've highlighted here, right? Whether it be alternative tobacco products, whether it be the political climate, whether it be the tobacco industry's investment in that region. These are things that need to be considered. And then I would also like to turn our attention to countries in the early epidemic stage, okay? So these are countries which have a low smoking prevalence, but weaker FCTC measures. So these are countries, I mean, they may not be in the early epidemic stage, but oftentimes we would find that they are, okay? Because smoking rates are already quite low there. And it's just because they haven't had as much intensive targeting by the tobacco industry, at least not yet, but it is coming. So in these kind of countries, I mean, there's an opportunity to nip the problem in the bud before it starts, right? Because if smoking prevalence rates are already, say, in the single digits and really just need to be reduced a little bit more, then also an interesting thing is that the FCTC measures on their own may actually be enough to achieve this, right? Because, for instance, when you look at countries that started considering tobacco endgames in the advanced stage of the epidemic. So countries where smoking rates have been, say, around 40%, and tobacco control measures have been bringing them down slowly. Yes, when you implement all of the FCTC measures, you might hit a wall where smoking rates will not go down beyond a certain point unless you have more novel measures, right? Like tobacco-free generation, like denicotizing cigarettes. But in countries like this, in the early epidemic stage, FCTC measures alone may actually be enough, because the smoking rates are already low. So it's more about maintaining a low smoking prevalence, stopping the tobacco industry from taking root, and perhaps driving down smoking rates a little bit more depending on what level you're at. So if it's like, say, close to 10% or 15%, then you just need to bring it down a bit more. So I do think that more attention needs to be paid to this region as well, simply because it's easier to, contain a can of worms before you've opened it. You know what I mean? So I do think that this is a region that is worth paying attention to. And then finally, our last cluster I would like to also mention is the more action needed cluster. Okay, so these are the countries with a high smoking prevalence and weak FCTC measures. Okay, so these are the ones that we would normally write off as, let's not bother thinking about an end game here, because they still have to really get serious about tobacco control and bring down smoking rates from perhaps they're close to 20 or even 30% in some of these countries. But the reason why I think it's definitely worth highlighting them anyway is because quite a few of these countries have official tobacco endgame targets. They want to be tobacco-free by a certain year, right? So Malaysia, for instance, is aiming to be tobacco-free. Bangladesh, the South Pacific Islands region, and Western Europe, which are covered by the regional EU target, right? So if the EU then has some kind of mandate where tobacco rates must be below a certain point, then there are countries in the Eastern European region where meeting that challenge, meeting those targets may be more of a challenge, and certainly for the other countries I mentioned as well. So then we also need to think about, okay, how could a tobacco endgame target be achieved, or how could a tobacco endgame help energize tobacco control efforts in some of these countries towards perhaps more of a long-term game towards tobacco endgame? And I mean, one interesting thing that we noted about the Pacific Islands region is when we look at the action plan for the South Pacific Islands, which is a region which has some of the highest smoking rates in the world, right? And some of the weakest FCTC scores. A big part of their action plan was focused on taxation, mainly as a preliminary step to raising enough resources for tobacco control, which could then be used for more aggressive measures, right? And I do think that this kind of step-by-step approach could be useful when thinking about an endgame in some of these countries, right? Rather than writing it off saying, okay, what would be the first step to really helping this country get on the road towards an end game, right? So it might be something more like a step-by-step approach where you start with taxation, ramping up of the FCTC measures, and then you progress to perhaps more novel or more aggressive measures after that. Okay, so when we think about the different considerations, okay, if we're moving towards a global tobacco endgame, right, into different regions, several things. So I think, first of all, it's important to highlight the progress and the successes that we've observed in some of the low and middle income countries, because I do think this is overlooked a lot, right, especially in our endgame discussions. And on that note, I also think that more endgame research and advocacy is needed in those countries. Okay, so thinking about, okay, this country is probably well positioned for it. So what are the barriers? Okay, so what would it take for an endgame to succeed in this country? What is needed? What more needs to be done? And how can we support these countries in their progress? I think these are very important questions that we need to pay more attention to, right? And especially the regions that I've mentioned, like Latin America and those African and Middle East to South Asian countries. I think a lot more attention needs to be paid to those regions. And when we talk about tobacco endgame targets, I mean, I mentioned in the beginning that generally speaking, the target is defined as, okay, smoking prevalence below 5%. But I think it's also important within that to consider the unique challenges of each country, right? Because I've mentioned, for instance, use of different tobacco products, right? In some countries, use of shisha and smokeless is more common than cigarette use. So endgame targets would have to consider use of these products as well. In some countries, there are great disparities between different groups, okay? And so some countries may consider differential targets for different subpopulations, right? And as I mentioned, also, there are some countries where the tobacco industry has been investing very heavily and where there's a lot of, say, tobacco farming, or where those countries are economically reliant on some extent to the industry. So then an endgame target may have to consider differential targets or specific targets for perhaps phasing out that kind of trade as well. And then in terms of endgame strategy, now I do think that one important message is that I don't think there's one size fits all here. I think it's very important to consider, what kind of stage the country's in, what progress the country has made, and not just where they're at currently, but where they are moving to and how fast they are moving to their targets. Okay. And as I mentioned, there are some measures that have been popular, like, for example, tobacco-free generation. It may not work in all countries, right? For example, this depends also on the demographics of a place, right? So, for example, we were looking at this in the context of Singapore, which has a very large aging population and a very low birth rate. So in a context like that, a measure like tobacco-free generation, which targets your younger generation, might not work as well or as quickly because it's only really targeting the younger generation, which is shrinking in our context. Whereas in places like Africa, where there's a higher birth rate, where the younger generation is growing very quickly, a measure like that might actually have more impact. So when we consider the strategy and the specific approach, it's very important to consider the progress, which stage, the context, all of these things. And of course, also important to leverage on political momentum. We see how quickly this has changed in different countries, and also regional targets, right? Because as we mentioned, there are two regions, South Pacific Island and European Union, that want to be tobacco free. And then of course, within those regions, EU being a good example, you're going to have countries that have taken a lot of leadership on tobacco control, and then there's going to be countries where they're not so advanced with it yet. But when you have these regional targets, it's an opportunity to try and draw more of those countries in the tobacco endgame, or at least to get them to set more ambitious tobacco control measures. So it is something that can benefit those as well. So it's good to try and leverage on that and see how we can leverage on that in different places. And finally, when we talk about the prevalence and the kind of smoking prevalence that would make a country tobacco endgame ready, I think it's important to focus as much on the decline rate of that prevalence and not just where it's at currently. So rather than focusing on, say, okay, 15% cutoff, or saying, okay, a country should have a prevalence of, say, less than 20 or whatever, it's important to look at how fast it's moving towards a decline. So the rate of decline, I would say, also is quite important to look at. Okay, so just to finish up, I would like to return to the map that I showed you at the beginning of the session. Okay, so this is the map with all of the countries in the world that have adopted an official tobacco endgame target, or that have started adopting tobacco-free generation proposals. So as I mentioned, there are 18 countries in the world that currently have endgame targets. And then in the US, we see a lot of local movements for tobacco-free generation. So, okay, let's call it 19 countries, okay? So what is interesting, I think, about this map is you notice that almost all of these countries are in the Western world, okay? They're North America, Western Europe, and Australasia. There's a few exceptions in Southeast Asia here, but mostly in the Western world. And when we think back to tobacco trade, right, some 100 years ago, this is pretty similar map that we saw, really. I mean, most of the tobacco trade started in the Western world, and then as the tobacco companies started seeing investment opportunity, they saw business opportunity in other regions of the world, they started investing very heavily in those regions. And that's why now we see that 80% of the world's smokers living in low and middle income countries, no longer in the Western world. So, I mean, the tobacco companies saw business opportunity, right? And I think we should start exploring the same. I think it's about time we did the same, and that we started moving to other world regions with our tobacco endgame, because I do think there's a tremendous opportunity to explore tobacco endgames and to support countries in achieving endgame targets around the world and to really make this a global thing. So if we started moving towards other regions, this is what our endgame map could look like, okay? So these are the countries that we considered to be in the endgame ready cluster. So if if all of those countries that have a smoking prevalence below 15% and advanced FCTC measures, if they went ahead and adopted tobacco endgame targets, this is what our endgame map would look like, all right? It would look like this if we also included those countries that have advanced FCTC measures. And like this, if we also paid attention to those countries that have low smoking rates that are in earlier stages of an epidemic. So that looks a hell of a lot better, I think. So yeah, I think my hope really is that with this tobacco endgame movement, that we can start thinking a bit more broadly about how it can be applied in different contexts, much like how we've been really trying to pay attention to how tobacco control measures can be applied in, say, the low and middle income context. I think we also need to start paying more attention to how can the tobacco endgame concept apply, and what would it take for endgame to succeed in these kind of countries. Okay, and with that, I would like to finish. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Yvette. That was a great presentation. So if anyone has, we do have a few people online. So if you have any questions, do put them in the chat. I'll kick off with some questions. So the first one's a methodological question. So I think I may have just went through too quickly the year that the prevalence data that you used to code all the countries as to whether they were endgame ready or nearly endgame ready at the beginning. What year did you use? Was it just the most recent year that you could find, or did you try to use the same year for all countries?
Yeah, so we used the World Health Organization's data for that. And at the time when we did this study, the most recent data set, I believe, was from 2021. around that time. Don't quote me on that, but it was around then. So the prevalence in 2021. So yeah, admittedly, there are some countries which perhaps may have changed into a different cluster since, because we know there has been quite a lot of fast progress in some of those countries. And it was the same actually for the FCT scores. That was from the same year, because it was just based on the latest global status report.
Yeah, interesting, because the Australian data is much lower than 15%, but obviously that's what's in that database, that
Yeah.
it's above 15%, because in 2021, that was around, well, let me see. Oh, well, yeah, it would have still been less than 15% by the official figures.
Right.
Yeah, so no, it's so that's interesting that the database obviously has a higher estimate for some countries than their national figures. Now, another question I had was around illicit trade. So in Australia, that's become a really hot topic because we've had some very notable increase in illicit trade. And that's something that often comes up, when we're talking about endgame policies or any tobacco control policies that are kind of a little bit more stringent and so on. People raise that as a concern. So did you have any thoughts on the issue of illicit trade and sort of how that fits into an endgame strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think whenever there's any kind of tobacco control measure, the illicit trade argument comes up, right? It comes up with taxation, it comes up with plain packaging, it comes up with flavors bans, it comes up with tobacco-free generation. It's going to come up with everything. So yeah, I do think it's important for countries in general to pay attention to it and to know how to curb illicit trade. But also the framing of the narrative, I think, is very important, because often this is an industry narrative that is pushed, and it doesn't necessarily reflect what is really going on, right? Because they, of course, like to say, all right, illicit trade is terrible, and it's going to be even worse if you do plain packaging or tobacco-free generation or endgame or whatever. So I think it's just another argument, another narrative that endgame advocates need to be prepared for and need to have the right data for and the right evidence to back it up and say, well, look, no, this endgame measure will not improve illicit trade because of X, Y, Z.
Okay. Now I've got some questions coming through. So did you consider the potential impact of vaping or e-cigarettes on tobacco endgame?
We wanted to stay neutral on the matter because you know that countries have very different stances on this. I mean, there are some countries where a tobacco endgame would probably do a carve out for vaping, like what we had in New Zealand, right? Then there are some countries where it would be banned just in the same way as tobacco. It really depends on what that country's stance is, you know? I think the most important thing, honestly, I mean, we want to see some unity in the movement, right? Like with the tobacco control in general, there's unity in the sense that we all want to get rid of tobacco, right? With the
Yeah.
end game, I think we need a similar sense of unity. So I think each country, again, you know, when I say that end game needs to be adapted for our country's context, that will also include the situation with vaping. And it's up to that country, really. Do they want to exempt vaping from that? Do they want to include it in that? It's up to that country. But I think we need to keep our eye on the main target, which is getting rid of tobacco products and creating unity, global unity, and not just tobacco control, but tobacco endgame movement.
Okay. Okay, I've got some people raising their hands. Can you use the Q&A function? And I'm getting through those in order. So another question, based on your perspective, what is the trend of political will in Singapore to continue lowering smoking prevalence? So this person's feeling a bit discouraged, seeing a lack of progress in the parliament there, particularly around secondhand smoke in, I think this must be high density housing.
Right.
So do HDB estates, or is that public housing?
That's public housing.
Yeah. So, yeah, do you have any comments on that in terms of where things are going politically in terms of tobacco control in Singapore?
Well, with Singapore, I mean, tobacco control progress in general has been quite good. I mean, right now, smoking prevalence is around 9%. So that's quite low. It's in the single digits already. So I do think that Singapore is very well positioned for an end game, could be one of the countries to succeed. But there has been no official end game target set in Singapore. I think partly, I mean, the government is generally quite conservative in that sense. Oftentimes, they will wait and see what happens in other countries. So it was the same with measures like plain packaging, right? They wait for Australia, see what happens there, and then if it's a success story, then they will consider it. And it's the same with measures like tobacco-free generation and setting an official endgame target. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I do think there's a need, you know, in countries like this that are ripe for an endgame to really see, okay, what are some of the gaps and how could we try and drive this narrative a bit further? And I do think we need leader countries. Remember at the beginning, I mentioned there are some countries that are basically daring enough to be the first. Countries like Australia with plain packaging, countries like Ireland with the smoke-free legislation. That's why we need these kind of countries, because it helps countries like Singapore that are conservative and that are just going to wait for other countries to take the lead.
To be honest, I think most countries want to do that, right? They don't want to be the first.
Which is why we see few daring ones. Australia, for instance, New Zealand, that's why we need those to take the lead. And then I think we will see like a diffusion, like what we see with plain packaging. I mean, now it's 20 plus countries that have it. So it does happen in that way, right?
Okay. And are there any countries that are looking at a nicotine endgame?
Good question. I mean, I guess it depends on their stance on vaping and whether vaping, I mean, for those endgame countries, right? Whether vaping would be included in their endgame or not. Yeah, I know there was some discussion in Malaysia about this, which was quite interesting because Malaysia wanted to do a tobacco-free generation, right? With the last government that they had, the health minister was very much trying to drive a tobacco-free generation. They call it the generational endgame there. And then there was a lot of discussion, especially I think from the vaping manufacturers, they were trying to lobby for exclusion for vaping products. But actually his stance was to include vaping products under that mandate. Because his idea was, well, if the intention is for vaping products to be a smoking cessation product, if these younger generations are not smoking, then what do they need vaping products for, right? So in that sense, yeah, I mean, but then I know that in other countries, they're being excluded. So again, it depends on their vaping stance.
Yeah, I think Finland was one country that has actually specified a nicotine-free goal or nicotine endgame, included that in their target from memory. But yeah, and I think also, some people are framing that tobacco-free generation policy around whether it's nicotine-free generation or tobacco-free. So yeah, that's a good example with Malaysia bringing that up. Okay, you didn't mention equity when considering how advanced countries are with endgames. Should that be considered, both whether equity is addressed by the goal or measures and the degree of prevalence of inequity?
Yeah, and I think, again, this will vary country by country, right? I mean, for instance, in Asian countries, there's a big gender gap between smoking prevalence rates. So, I mean, the targets for male smoking versus female smoking may differ. I know that in New Zealand, there was a lot of consideration to the Maori versus the non-Maori prevalence rates, right, to try and help narrow that health inequality gap. I know in Scotland, their strategy was also focusing on differential targets for different groups because, for instance, among the low socioeconomic, the folks in the low socioeconomic group, smoking rates were a lot higher. So they were looking at other measures to help bring down smoking prevalence, more intensified or targeted measures. So yeah, I do think it's important to pay attention to that. And not just inequality between different groups of people, but also different types of product, for instance. I mean, we talked a little bit about the high rates of shisha and smokeless use in some regions. So for countries like that, perhaps they need to look at, okay, what are the different targets for, say, smokeless use versus cigarettes, right? And then, of course, the vaping, that's another angle.
Okay, another question here. So I recall that there is a World Corruption Index, which can be taken as a correlate of tobacco industry influence that would make an interesting marker of readiness or feasibility for endgame moves. So do you have any thoughts on that, incorporating things like corruption into a measure?
Yeah, and I think for some regions, this is very important consideration, actually. I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about Africa, right? And how there's a lot of industry investment in that region currently because of the booming youth population, because enforcement might not be as high in some of the countries, and they're seeing an opportunity and they're really aggressively marketing their products there and trying to target the youth there. And then also, setting measures against tobacco industry interference, I think will be an important marker in some of these countries on, being able to withstand, for example, being able to implement those FCTC measures properly. So yeah, I think in some regions, this is a very important thing that needs to be looked at, And I mean, of course, the study that we did, it's not really, think of it as a starting point, for more nuanced, more in-depth kind of studies in this area. This is what I would like to see. And I do think there's definitely scope to improve our measures, our systematic measures using these kind of indices.
And John also points out very rightly that a nicotine endgame is actually quite typical in some of those US localities. that you identified that are implementing those endgame measures like tobacco-free generation in their locality. So they are actually including all those non-therapeutic nicotine products in those in that policy.
Yep.
Okay, another comment here. Thank you for an excellent presentation. In countries where tobacco companies still operate, so for example, South Korea and Japan, imagine tobacco control efforts may face more resistance. What are your thoughts on how to address these challenges?
Yeah, that's a difficult one because obviously it's going to be, I'm guessing in those countries, the political will may not be there, right? To really go ahead with these kind of measures. So that is tricky. Yeah. So I do think there's a need to reduce the reliance on that trade or to change the narrative. Because often in this kind of countries, also the tobacco industry uses this narrative of economic benefits to the country, right? But really it's anything but. So I think in these kind of studies, like more economic models and more data to show just how detrimental tobacco is to the economy, I think that will be quite an important way to improve the political will to then go ahead and set tobacco endgame measures.
Yeah, it also raises an interesting situation, doesn't it, where a country may actually be also the tobacco industry themselves. And in some respects, you know, where a government has control over the tobacco manufacturing or wholesaling, you think, well, they're actually in a good position if they wanted to phase it out. But then that's also a barrier too, isn't it? So the complexity of managing that industry angle.
Yeah. And the framing and how they manage to maintain their hold there. So I think it's about also generating evidence to challenge this framing, those narratives that the industry has created.
Okay. And so the next question I have is what's the next step? So you mentioned there about maybe like that there are other, you know, we had that discussion about other measures that could be incorporated into an assessment and so on. Are there plans to like sort of revisit and go into more depth into each country that you've identified as being priority countries?
Yeah, I do think that's the next step is to, I mean, we're already working on this a little bit, is, you know, picking out some of these countries, you know, the ones that were, say, in the endgame ready cluster, or where we know a lot of progress has been made, and then seeing, okay, what would it take for an endgame to succeed in this country? You know, so what are some of the unique considerations that need to be made for this country? What are some of the barriers? What are some of the reasons why endgame is not being pursued? For instance, is it because, you know, the resources are lacking, or is it because the concept simply doesn't translate into the cultural context, or is it something else? At this point, we don't really know much about that. So it would be interesting to know what that is. And also, as we progress more towards making this more of a global thing, you know, I think it's important to understand how it translates into the different concepts so that it can be made more inclusive in that sense.
So another issue that comes up is around data quality. So particularly like some countries have got really good monitoring of tobacco use, but then other countries, they may not be monitoring tobacco use very often. Might be many years between you know, data collections. So is that something that has you know, maybe played a role in how you've dealt with coding? So you've had to use obviously the WHO database and so on, but not all countries have got any data even really on what their current smoking prevalence is. So is that another barrier or challenge for, you know, countries to even know whether they're ready for an endgame?
Yeah, it was a challenge in our study because there were a number of countries that we had to exclude because we just could not find the data. I mean, there are a few we exclude because they have not ratified the FCTC, so they're not included in things like the scorecard system. Then there were others for which the prevalence data was not available, or we couldn't get data on, say, whether they'd implemented taxes and to what extent. So yeah, there were a number like that, and it would be good, you know, because we know like in some of these countries there has been quite a lot of progress. Like the US, for example, the US was not included in our study because it has not ratified the FCTC. But we know also that in the US, a lot of progress has been made with tobacco endgame in certain localities. So it would be interesting to do more research on that, you know. And then there were other countries, like I remember in the African region, like Uganda, you know, I know that country has made quite a lot of progress too, but we couldn't include it because of lack of data. So yeah, I think for those kind of countries, it would be good to maybe do more of a in-depth study, because there are probably other data sources out there available. It's just they weren't in the World Health Organization, because we wanted to use a standardized data source so we could compare the different countries, right?
Yeah.
But if we wanted to do more of an in-depth study of, say, a country that was excluded, like, for example, Uganda, then there may be national data available from, say, their statistics or through key informants and so forth. So there are ways to study it, I think. Really, it's just a starting point. This is how I like to think of this project, is as a starting point.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I think we've gotten through all our questions that were put in the Q&A. If there are any last questions, get it in right now, or else I might call the webinar to a close. Thank you so much, Yvette, for presenting your research to us and sharing your thoughts on Endgame policy and how it may be able to be spread more equitably across the globe. We really appreciated your time today.
All right, thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. All right, bye now.
Bye, thanks, everyone.